All right, great. Well, first of all, big shout out to all of you, all early stage folks. It is hard, as you know, to be part of a startup in the best of times in a strong economy. And you throw COVID-19 into the mix, and it is challenging with a capital C. And before we get into the presentation, I'm going to give you some insight into my mental model of a startup. And actually, it was formed when I was in high school. So I'm one of 7 kids, grew up in LA. And my father he was an executive at a Fortune 500 company and decided he wanted to go start a company. And at that time, raising money was a bank loan and you mortgaged your house. So he went and did that, and wham, the recession hit. So as a teenager during that time, we experienced very firsthand the struggle when that hit, the period as he moved past it of being more steady and sort of the survival stage, and then finally got to see it through to where the business really thrived and triumphed. And so my mental model around startups is just that there are these cycles, and there's often struggle, and often you get to survival, and then often you get to a place where you're thriving. And we've been hit pretty hard with this one. It's a big challenge, but the things that we'll talk about here, and the things that you also learn when you really have to double down and be very both strategic and tactical, are going to serve you well and create a lot of resilience in you as an operating member of your team, whatever it is. So I guess my point here is embrace the challenge, and moving through it is going to really help, will just really help along the way. All right, a little bit about Tidelift. So we provide a managed open source subscription for actually hundreds and thousands of open source packages that are not commercially maintained. So the ones that are just maintained by open source contributors themselves. Think about sort of like Linux, Red Hat is to Linux. Tidelift is for these thousands of open source packages out there. We were founded in 2017, actually by a really experienced team from Red Hat that helped build the $4 billion enterprise open source business there. So these 4 saw big gap in the market, and where there's a big gap, there's often a big opportunity. And we're all 100% remote, and we've already started to see some of that, just the early signs of it. So as I said before, my background, my mental model comes from having a father who was an entrepreneur. I'm classically trained in sales from some of the big companies, which was an amazing experience. Xerox, Wang, probably nobody knows that company anymore. Hewlett Packard, those were the only big companies that I worked for. After that, I guess because of my father, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, I've always been really attracted to the startup. And so I've spent a lot of time, I started my own company, which I sold in 2005. And then since then have either been advising early stage startups or had an operating role. And before I hand it over to Chris to give an introduction, Ted had asked me, and y'all may have the same question, why have marketing in the presentation for sales priorities? And I'll tell you why. Not only do we operate as a single team, but actually Chris and his team are responsible for recruiting and training the largest and most influential sales team that we have at Tidelift. And that's the people that we're selling to. And I'll give you an example that happened actually last week. So we've got a meeting with a very large financial services organization that we're in a sales cycle with. And they had just hired a new distinguished engineer to come to the meeting. And they told us that in the interview process, as our contact at the bank was explaining the different challenges they were having with maintaining their open source software, this distinguished engineer said, "Don't you all know about Tidelift? Tidelift is the company who does that," and starts basically giving him our pitch. You cannot get a better, more influential, timely salesperson. So marketing is just sales multiplied across a lot of channels. They're really the top of the funnel and we're the bottom of the funnel. So as you're thinking about sales priorities at this time, don't forget to kind of open the aperture and think about what happens up at the top. And we're going to talk about some of those tactics, but sales priorities absolutely includes the bigger message and the bigger voice. And if there is one thing that you take away, I'm sorry, Chris, for saying this right now, I would take away Chris's contact information, because I think he is one of the best in tactics and techniques for us, a relatively new company, to have a very large and outsized voice in the market. It's been incredibly important in terms of paving the way for conversations for the sales team. Okay, now Chris, you can introduce yourself.
Thanks for making me blush there, Bridget. I appreciate that. So just by way of background, before getting the awesome opportunity to work with Bridget, who equally you will want to spend time with her afterwards, because I've learned so much from her just in the last few months that we've gotten a chance to work together. My background, accidental marketer, never had any background in marketing, but somehow stumbled into Red Hat very early. I was one of the first 100 employees at Red Hat, one of the first marketing people. Built a large corporate marketing team over about a decade. By the time I left, Red Hat was $1 billion business, and now it's part of IBM. And I think IBM bought them for like $34 billion or something like that. It's a crazy story, seeing what Red Hat looks like now. When I left Red Hat, this is interestingly enough, I left in 2008, at the very end of 2008, right at the heart of the worst financial crisis to that point in history, to start my own agency, and left with a few other Red Hat executives. And so we built from the bottom of the worst crisis that I'd seen in my lifetime. We built a multi-million-dollar agency over the next 10 years. And I left that agency. I actually sold it to my share to my other partners to join one of our clients, which was Tidelift, which was founded by 4 of my old friends from Red Hat back in the day. So kind of came home. So I actually, again, an accidental marketer, where I was doing marketing at Red Hat, but then I basically was the president of a company and the head of sales for 10 years. And then now back into a marketing role. So I never really even consider myself a marketing person. I consider myself to be a salesperson more than anything else as well.
All right, thank you. So this is just a reminder that we've seen big things before. The 70s was when my father was going through this, and I remember waiting in lines for an hour, and you could only go odd days if you could only go Monday, Wednesday, Friday if your license plate ended in an odd number. So went from a gas shortage to a toilet paper shortage. Again, just a reminder, there can be a cyclical nature to this, and let's not let them surprise us. Always be at the ready. And then y'all know this. And again, it's just to get in the mindset of, we can do this. We can get through this. There are companies that were founded and have thrived in a recession. So let's make sure your companies get on the slides 10 years from now, that the companies from Heavybit are going to be up here on a slide, and somebody else is going to be talking about how y'all did it. All right, message to remember: there's still money out there, but you have to go find it. So the river has been diverted, but know that the current is still flowing. So it's still there. There was an interesting survey that Mayfield did. I saw this last week among CXOs and CIOs. I don't know if y'all saw it, but it had some really interesting statistics that I've seen validated in different places. And I think, again, is important to remember that one, which I think is interesting, 8% of IT budgets are actually increasing because of COVID-19. 20% said there's been no impact. 30% said that there is an impact, but it's going to be short-lived. And 50% are accelerating these digital optimization efforts. So again, and we're going to talk about this in the presentation, the task at hand here, number one, is to find out where's the river flowing, where's it been diverted, and how are you able to tap into that? So in a recession, there will be additional opportunities. And again, your job is to find and exploit the opportunities that recessions create. I've really lent super heavily on Chris and his team that are always scanning the news to look for trends and things that are happening and what our target market is saying. Is there a different target market we should be going after? So that we can position ourselves at Tidelift to exploit the opportunities that are being created. And it's really important to remember that. Your competitors are expecting to lose business, so let them. So when there's a hill and the weather's bad and it's stormy and others slow down, speed up. And now's the time to do it. So a couple things to remember is it isn't the end of the world, although with COVID-19, it sometimes feels like it. But there has been a shift in priorities and spending. Not all businesses are hurt the same. So I think that's another really important thing to remember. Not everybody's the same. Are you targeting the right people and the right companies to make sure that you're going after a target that actually has the opportunity potential to buy? We were on a Foundry group call. They're one of our investors a week or so ago, and we were talking about actually sales quotas and how people were adjusting to having to readjust quotas. And one of the portfolio companies said they were actually adjusting their quotas up because they found more opportunity. They definitely found an opportunity that the recession created. Again, you want to solve a problem that gets worse in a recession, and your uniqueness and being able to really talk about that and explain that is super important. And I don't put these up here as just facts to file. These aren't facts to file. These are questions that you want to be asking yourselves about the products and services that you're offering to make sure that you're relevant to your target and what they're experiencing. So we're going to talk about sales priorities sort of along these 4 vectors. Number one is who? Are you targeting the right companies? And that's a big one. 50% of sales time is wasted on poor prospects. And right now, you don't have 50% of the time to waste. So an exercise around identifying who are the right targets for you now is really important. Number 2 is what? Does your product offering need to shift in some way in order to meet the demands and the opportunities that a recession does present? So kind of looking at your product. How are you reaching out? For Tidelift, a large part of our lead flow was through events. We're not doing events now. So how are we pivoting and thinking about the how, given the current situation? And then finally, why? What's the messaging that when you're communicating to prospects, whether it's in the large scale on the marketing or further down the funnel in sales, that when budgets are being cut, that you're going to be above the line? Why this product or service, why you to deliver it, and why should it be done now? So those are the four vectors that we're going to talk about in terms of thinking about sales priorities at this time.
Cool. So let's dive in. Let's start getting in. We'll start with who, like what are the targets that right now make the most sense? And a lot of this is like super maybe obvious stuff, but worth saying anyway, which is, starting with like what industries are doing okay right now. Like you need to go where there is still water in the well, right? And this article I thought was pretty interesting. There've been probably 10 or 15 articles like this. I've read them all. There where people are sort of saying what industries are winning and losing and what industries are kind of a toss up, and depending on what you're selling might be good and might be bad. Obviously, airlines have other things to do other than investing in new products these days, but even airlines, there may be opportunities for certain IT investments, digital transformation that maybe it's been put off for a while, that it's ready to happen now. So I think this is the first thing, is just looking at what industries are you going after, and are your target industries in good shape going into this. The second thing is thinking about, like, within those industries, are there particular types of initiatives that are going to accelerate maybe in this sort of environment? I mean, we're all seeing the same thing. We're sitting here doing a Zoom call. There's things like digital transformation that are probably going to happen. So on that last slide, you showed banking was sort of an in-between. But if the way you're working with the banking industry is to provide things that might help them accelerate their digital transformation effort so they can continue to work seamlessly, say when the next coronavirus hits, then you may have an opportunity there, right? So that's important to think about. We loved this particular tweet. Some of you may have seen this. Who led the digital transformation of your company, the CEO, the CTO, or COVID-19? Obviously this is encouraging many industries to actually accelerate some of their efforts related to the technologies that some of us on this in this meeting are working on. And then another way to think about it is, follow the money by the size of the company or by financial health. So for example, there have been several articles that you've read about how the biggest and healthiest tech companies, the Googles and Apples and Amazons and Facebooks of the world, are probably going to go on an acquisition spree and start buying as things hit bargain basement prices. Well, they may be making other sorts of investments where they feel like they can get good deals too. So you want to go after the companies that are well suited to be in good financial health going into this, but also even beyond just looking at an industry level, there might be just simple things that caused a company to be in the right place at the right time around this COVID-19 crisis. So for example, maybe they just raised a round of funding right before the crisis happened. Or on the other side, a company that's in a good industry, maybe they didn't raise a round of funding right before the crisis happened. And even though they're in a good industry, they're in a bad place. So really starting to look deeper at your sales targets and see, like, how are they doing from a financial standpoint is going to be really important too. And so to kind of put all that in a bow, we thought this was a really nice chart that Closer IQ put together, where if you do your sort of standard 2x2 diagram and you look at the very best, you're targeting companies that are strong in the COVID crisis, but also have strong financials. And you probably want to mostly ignore companies that are in, badly hit industries or have weak financials. And then you can kind of look on a case-by-case basis at companies that might be in a poor financial position, but be strong related to the industry they're in around COVID, or the opposite is true too. But this is a nice kind of simple way of sort of thinking about and looking at your sales targets through a different lens. And then the next thing we wanted to talk about is the sort of like, how do you make changes to your product offering, and do you need to make changes? Like immediately, as soon as Bridget and I saw this, we were having conversations about what needed to change about Tidelift's messaging and what we would need to do differently to sell in this environment. And so I'll give you kind of an example. First, best case, and I would say we feel pretty good about this right now, but again, the rubber's going to hit the road at some point. We're going to see whether this really works. But my experience, as Ted pointed out at the beginning, I was at Red Hat through the first .bomb crisis in the early 2000s, watched as Red Hat stock price went from $150 a share to $1.30 a share. It was the most glorious time in Red Hat because we were going through this massive Unix to Linux migration for which that recession was a huge opportunity. It just created, people were buying this expensive proprietary hardware that Sun was making, these Solaris servers, they were putting Unix on it, and all of a sudden Linux was around, which is what Red Hat was selling, and you were able to buy a cheap Dell x86, white box piece of hardware and run the same workloads on it. And those were the glory days for Red Hat. And then the same thing happened in 2008 for Red Hat as well, is when we went into the cloud migration, after the recession, where people were trying to figure out, how do I get rid of these big expensive data centers and go migrate over to AWS or Google Cloud or whatever. It created a next wave of people moving even more workloads onto open source. So, we feel like we got a pretty good historical story here. In fact, the bottom post of these two, our CEO, Donald Fisher, just posted this morning the third wave of open source migration, kind of making the case that those first two waves of open source migration were preceded immediately by a big recession, and perhaps now is a chance for new workloads to move over to open source. Well, you may be able to look at your particular value prop and say, we have a story here. This is what Bridget and I worked out in the first weeks of the crisis. We said, what is our saving money, cutting cost story? We went back and did the research, and lo and behold, it was sort of like the four founders of Tidelift and myself had all seen this script before. And so we feel like we're in a pretty good place to tell this story in an authentic way. But we've also had to do some sort of simpler transitionary things. Like Bridget and I had just launched a consulting offering called the Tidelift Advisory Workshop, where we were just starting to sign up our first clients to go and do essentially a design thinking inspired workshop where we go in, we bring all of their different groups together, and then all of a sudden now we can't meet in person anymore. And all of our advisory workshops immediately went from like super potential to like zero potential. So in the last 2 weeks, we just launched this actually last week. We changed the advisory workshop into what we call an open source diagnostic, which essentially takes it into an offline process where we do interviews with people, we bring them together in a collaborative sort of Zoom meeting environment. We do the consulting, then we go offline, process the results, then we come back and report and give them a report out of it. Basically the same thing, but just had to reframe it for the times, right? And reframe the way we handle the offering. So just a couple of examples there, but thinking through really clearly, what is your value prop and what has to change in order for it to still resonate in these sort of crazy times we're in. All right, so the next one we wanted to talk about is reaching prospects. Obviously, as the marketing guy, I have a piece of this, and as Bridget said earlier, we took a huge hit. The sort of lazy marketer loves events because you can go to one place, you can just pop down some money, and you can, hit a couple of thousand, sometimes more people all at one time, get them to just scan their badges, and all of a sudden you got leads to work on for a few months. Well, that doesn't exist. And it might not exist for the rest of the year. Like right now, we have some events that we have targeted for late Q3 and early Q4, but we're not counting on it. We've built a plan for how we're going to reach prospects that doesn't rely on events at all. And so this is one of the things that I feel best about in my career, is that when I went through that first time at Red Hat, where I was running, sort of the creative marketing group at Red Hat, I didn't even know that people had marketing budgets, because this was my first real marketing job. And, our stock was trading at like a couple bucks a share. And so we just had to like figure it out without spending. There was no AdWords. There was no, easy way to go get leads. So we did it with very few people and almost zero budget. We just figured out how to do things that would drive interest and drive leads. And we've been kind of taking the same tack here at Tidelift over the last couple of weeks. Is just, one of the things I always believe is that if there's a big story out there, if there's a big like, go where the story is and try to make yourself part of a conversation that's already happening, rather than always trying to force the conversation to be around your company. So, just a couple of examples here is, immediately as soon as we saw this happening, one of the things I started thinking about is, I said, gosh, we have a lot of experience as a remote first company, as everybody else is having to go and try to figure out how to work from home. We're all pretty much remote. We've been doing it for a while. What expertise could we share, and what conversations could we be a part of? So, Lauren, who wrote this article here on the left, Double Shift Parenting and Working Remotely, she has 2 young kids under the age of 4. She had been kind of juggling having them at home sometimes and trying to work at the same time. And so she and I wrote up a post together. We got it posted up on Dev2 and on our website. And she got picked up by the Wall Street Journal, that wrote an article basically mostly about her, about 60% about her experience about the new normal of working from home. So again, it's sort of like in Dev2, if some of you are familiar with posting on Dev2, it's actually free. It doesn't cost you anything. You can post any article you want to up there. We take advantage of it. We do it all the time. But they actually retweeted ours. They have about 160,000 followers, and they retweeted this post with that little sort of shorthand, don't panic, prepare your home for remote thing. So that was all free. It didn't cost us anything, and got some extra attention for Tidelift. We wrote some other stories about how open source software is fighting COVID-19. That one got published on opensource.com, which has huge millions and millions of readers. And then Jeremy Katz wrote another one, sort of a basic primer on working from home. So this is just one tactic of like inserting ourselves into the conversations that were happening out there in a way that was valuable. Not necessarily like, there's nothing in here about buying a Tidelift subscription. This is all educational, and this is all sort of building our brand as a brand you could trust. So we are also doing some things that more directly drive leads too. And again, we're trying to get creative. As we said earlier, one of our key targets has been financial services, because we've seen that, certainly my experience has been that financial services industry has led some of these past open source migrations. First the Unix to Linux, and then the move over to the cloud. And so we started creating content that's very specifically targeted at that financial service audience. So this is one we just put out a couple of weeks ago, with 7 key trends that financial services firms, especially going into a recession, should be watching in 2020. And on the right side, this one's a little bit more fun that we're doing. So we had this idea that we wanted to figure out how to tell our story in a unique way. And we're struggling, like, how do you do it? We are actually getting ready to do a direct marketing, like direct mail campaign, like where we actually physically send something to somebody, because now, sadly enough, that's a way to stand out. And so we had this idea that while people were working from home, what if we put together a children's book version of the Tidelift story? So this is something we're working on right now, which is, it's called Cooking with Tidelift, and it's a children's book that explains how Tidelift works, that we'll send out via email the offer with hopefully a screenshot of what the book looks like and everything like that, and say, hey, if you want us to send this, we'll send this to your house, and it can be a way you can share work with your child. And Bridget is one of the characters in it, as you can see. Bridget loves to cook. So that's just, we're trying to get creative. We're trying to do things that are a little different, that will maybe stand out, and who knows if it'll work, but at least we're trying interesting and cool stuff, and we're excited about it. And hey, it's not every day at work you get to design a children's book, so we love that too. And another lesson I learned during the lean days in years at Red Hat was, if you don't have money, find somebody else who does. So I'll give you one example. So this is 2002 at Red Hat. We couldn't go out. We couldn't afford to do like direct mail anymore. All you had was basically email marketing. There were no AdWords or anything like that in those days. And so we wanted to go out and find our customers around the country. And so we had this idea that we were going to do a Red Hat road tour and put 4 or 5 of our engineers in an RV, drive across the country. This is right when blogging was first big. So we were going to write a blog about the whole experience. And we ended up getting the entire thing paid for by IBM. We did not pay a cent on this entire thing because IBM was so excited at the time to be associated with the Red Hat brand and this sort of like community brand. And this thing was crazy. Like, we sent these guys out. We thought they were going to sleep on the RV the whole time, but five guys, sweaty 20-somethings on an RV after a couple of days didn't work out so well. So IBM even helped us pay for hotels for them. But they were having like 200-300 people show up at every stop. People knew they were coming. People would drive 10 hours out of their way to meet the RV along the way. And there was nothing to see. It was just like an RV with some dude sleeping in it, and they just wanted to hear them talk about Red Hat. But again, IBM paid for the whole thing. We ended up doing the same thing 2 years later, but we took it around the world. I went on this one. You can see on the right-hand side, we did our standard version and enterprise version of the thing so that people could speak whichever language they were, since we did have enterprise customers at that point. But this thing actually got written up in Marketing News. And again, we had, I remember one event in Japan where we had 800 people show up in the room for this. And again, this one, the entire thing was paid for by IBM and HP. And we even got to travel business class around the world, which again, for a guy with no marketing budget, was pretty awesome. Did the same thing when we were trying to, as I mentioned, in that Unix to Linux migration phase, we were trying to get to Wall Street. And we couldn't afford to do things like full page ads in the Wall Street Journal. So we partnered up with Compaq, did this full page ad. And this was kind of like a landing figurehead of the beginning of when we made that first big Unix to Linux transition in the financial services market. But it's not just money. I mean, sometimes you may not have, the right things to be able to get somebody to pay for, $100,000+ full page ad. And, I'm not sure I would even recommend that today. That was something that worked almost 20 years ago. But think about the other assets that you could utilize from partners or other companies that you might work with beyond money. So are the people who are connected to target verticals or already have customers in industries that you're trying to get into that you could maybe swap something with a value in order to partner with them? Or are there media partners that might be looking to have fresh content or new ideas or whatever, who could help you reach large audiences? I mentioned Dev2 earlier. Dev2 is an amazing resource right now. I can't understand why more companies don't take advantage of it. We just, every other media sponsorship we do, we're like, why are we paying for this when we're getting all this stuff from Dev2 for free and we're getting this reach? There are podcasts that are looking for interesting new content or are struggling to get good people to come on and say things. Again, the key here is to be educational versus outright salesy, but often a good way to extend your reach. And then the third thing I would say is just looking for partners who can actually help establish you and establish your credibility. And even in those Red Hat cases I mentioned earlier, it was pretty cool to be able to go around the country, around the world, and have IBM and HP there, have IBM and HP show up at those stops. And we were just like this little nothing technology company that most people hadn't heard of unless they'd heard of open source. And so to be able to associate with those big brands was valuable to us and helped us build our brand at a really critical time during a tough market. So Bridget, I'll pass it over to you.
Let me unmute myself. So Chris has been talking about some of the top of the funnel activities, which, like I said, are super important. He's recruiting and educating my sales team, the people that are actually out there. One of the things, to his last point about finding the right partners, we partnered recently with a sales team at Oracle that is trying to have just more relevance in some of their accounts. And there's nothing formal that we put together other than we're working together on technology events. They're paying for it. And they want us to come along so that we can expand the conversation. So there are lots of interesting things, I think, to Chris's point, that you can do along that line. So when you get to the one-on-one conversation, this quote is from an EVP of IT at Bank of America, and it was a webinar that I attended about how do you sell and get into financial services, particularly the IT. One of the quotes was, if you're a startup and you know you can solve the problem, just be aggressive and get to the right person. So and I've heard this more than once, they've got problems that they need solving, and they're actually looking more than they did before because the problems are very ever present. So some of the things specifically that came out of it, and again have been validated across channels and different things that we've read, and certainly in our own experience, to be pleasantly persistent and respectfully persistent. The message here is really important, and the ones that resonate right now are, one, if you can help them reduce cost, that's probably number one. And then number two is helping them to eliminate the possibility of failure. And what that would show up for a Tidelift prospect or customer is, in a financial institution, one thing that a bank cannot afford right now is a security breach. Can't afford it. So any messages that we can communicate that are going to help them with that, those land really well right now. So think about those too. No automated templates. So a couple of things here. One, you want to make sure, if you're not already, to make sure you're doing what you can so that your emails don't get caught in any sort of a spam filter. That's number one. Number two is looking at subject lines. And Chris had made a comment when we had a marketing team meeting, our joint meeting, and he said, you know, y'all are writing beautiful prose, but when I look at the open rates, they're not getting opened. It doesn't matter if you have a beautiful message if it's not getting opened. So really looking and testing what those subject lines are. And there's not a one subject line fits all. So you've got to, it depends on the industry and the level that you're sending to. It depends on what the ask is, if it's an event or something informational. On average, I heard recently, it takes 0.7 seconds for someone to decide whether or not they're going to open an email. So your subject lines are really important to make sure you're testing. Getting in touch with people with the problem. In sales, I typically encourage my team to sell high. And while that's still really important, we had what I've heard on this webinar, and also had it validated from a VP of engineering at a bank recently that we're again in a sales cycle with, is that now it's also really important to be talking to the people who have the problem. And this VP of engineering said to me last week, you know, when our devs are behind it, that's what we're listening to as an executive. If they want it, we're listening to the things they need, because we got to make sure that they continue to be able to work productively. Make sure you concentrate on fewer leads, but contact them more. And I'm going to caveat the contact them more by saying you need to focus on education rather than promotion. You don't want to train your prospects to ignore you. If you send them a lot of junk, you're training them to ignore you in anything that comes from your company. So really focus on education. Again, another reason why we are so tightly entwined with marketing is because we've got the amazing content that we send, and at high quality of different kinds and at different touch points that the team can use. I've never been at a company that's had so much really high quality content that's applicable all along the buyer's journey. There's another interesting stat that I read recently that said 95% of buyers, 95, buy from someone who's provided content to them, educational, important information all along the process. They've been relevant throughout. So I don't underestimate or undervalue the importance of this education, especially at this time. Networking is important. People are getting more emails than ever before, and more emails than ever before are not even being opened. So one of the things that we also did recently is we went through all the executives of the company. We did this in an automated fashion through LinkedIn. but we looked at all of their first degree contacts at our target opportunities and our target companies that we're going after. And, you know, people change jobs. This is something that's actually a best practice and should be done pretty frequently. And one that surfaced was actually a contact of Chris's at a company that we're in communication with, that not only helped us get into that account, but reached out to someone else that's at a different target account that we happen to be going after and saying, hey, have you heard about Tidelift? They're doing some interesting things. They're having this webinar. So really leveraging the connections that you have, whether it's with your investors, your angels, just your community, to make sure you leverage that. And then as Chris talked about, don't underestimate sort of the human component of it. And in one-on-one communication, it doesn't need to be a lot, but a one line saying, I know this is a challenging time. Or for us, we also deal a lot with healthcare, and to thank them. Thanks for being on the front lines for the rest of us. All right, next slide and next section is why. And this is as important as any of them. Why should you be above the line? So why this product or service? Why should they be looking at any solution in this close to what you're doing? Why you? What's your differentiator? And why should they do it now as opposed to doing it later? And the way that Tidelift thinks about it, as an example, is we've really anchored on this wave that Chris was talking about, that in recessions, companies tend to move towards open source. We're not going to go create a wave, but we are going to go attach ourselves to this wave. So why would you participate in moving more applications to open source? One is to reduce cost. So we really anchor on that message. Why you, meaning why Tidelift? Tidelift is the only managed open source solution out there for these applications that are community led. So we're very unique also with this relationship we have with the open source maintainers. So we have a unique position. And then why now? Why now? It's COVID-19. COVID-19 is forcing this digital transformation and saving cost, and at least in our target markets, a real push to look at this. So let's pause there. We're all in it together. Everybody stay healthy, stay safe, stay optimistic. Hopefully, like I said, y'all will be on that NASCAR slide of companies that thrived in a recession. Hope to see the names here.